I do wish you'd let me read that passage. I would have milked it.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm still waiting to be discovered. And my one chance for drama is when I give readings for my books, actually, or record the audiobooks, which of course I do. First of all, I just have to echo what John said. What an amazing opportunity to be sharing the table, the carpet, with these two men, these two wonderful writers, both of whose work I really admire. And we're so well paired,
Yes.
quite apart from the fact that we just
That we love
like
each
each
other.
other
Yeah.
and like each other's work. This year actually marks the 40th anniversary, I am not sure if you were born, John, of the publication of my first book. This is my 13th. And you know, sometimes, when you're younger, you're sort of waiting for that, that big hit book. My big source of pride and joy in my writing life at this point is endurance. And I'm just so happy that 40 years later, I'm still here. I want to talk about how this particular book came to be. They've all got their backstory. Although one of the things that I recognize is that there is a through line to all my work, which would appear to differ a great deal. But I'm going to talk a little bit about that too, the obsessions that don't change. And I'm sure that's true for you too. So, after her. In addition to my writing life, one of the things I love to do on occasion is to teach. Although I'm primarily a fiction writer, I teach a memoir workshop. I love to help people tell their stories, including people who have absolutely no professional aspirations, who just have a story that they want to make sense of. And it has been my experience from my own life as a writer of memoir that there's no better way to do it than to apply to one's own story the discipline and structure of the writing craft. I've discovered a lot of truths that I didn't know until I put them on the page. So I host this writing workshop. It's also my way of being able to teach because I'm a college dropout. So nobody was employing me, so I employed myself. And 2.5 years ago, it's a very intense day at my house in Mill Valley on Mount Tam, where I'd lived for the last 17 years. 2 women showed up at my workshop who were sisters. And this is, first of all, adult women, a little younger than me. They were in their 40s. This was, first of all, the sort of surprising thing. I get a lot of sisters who come to my workshop wanting to talk about their sister. Not necessarily favorably, but to come together. And it developed that the story, neither one of them wanted to publish a book, get on Oprah's couch. They had a very particular experience that they wanted to make sense of, and it was still many years later haunting them. And it was that they had grown up in Marin County. Are there people here who lived in Marin County or the Bay Area in the late 70s, early 80s? And you may know this story. I didn't live here at that point, but there was at the time a man killing women on Mount Tam, and he became known as the Trailside Killer. And for almost a full 2 years, he was on the loose, and women kept showing up dead. Initially on Mount Tam, although later in Point Reyes and some other places. And these 2 women, who were then 13 and 11, favorite ages of mine to write about, were the daughters of the homicide detective who had been placed in charge of that investigation. Their parents were divorced. They lived with their mother. The real town was Novato. And their father was this larger-than-life San Francisco native, Italian-American hero dad, this all-powerful, charming, handsome, charismatic man who had seen himself as the protector of women. As his ex-wife, their mother says in the book, he loved women, just too many of them. Every character, has to have a fatal flaw. And the older sister actually that day, sitting in my living room, looking out at Mount Tam, said, "Oh, you would have fallen in love with our father." And I knew right away what she meant. And in fact, when I later wrote this book, I did fall in love with their father. It's one of the things you get to do. You get to have whole other lives and relationships if you're writing a book. But the story, as they were trying to make sense of it, was that their hero father could not catch the killer. Never did, actually. The trailside killer ultimately was apprehended in Santa Cruz County by a completely different law enforcement officer, and they watched their father crushed by his inability to solve this case. And he died in his early 40s, just a few years after the real trailside killer was arrested. That's the real story. And I want to say very swiftly, I never appropriate anybody's story from a memoir workshop. But after the workshop, everybody else had gone home, but I loved these two women. I loved their relationship with each other. I am myself one of two sisters, and I love my sister, and I know my sister loves me, but we've had a lot of problems over the years, as sisters often do. Somebody said recently after reading this book, she said, yeah, my sister and I are on hiatus at this point. My sister and I were often on hiatus. These two sisters were never on hiatus. I have never seen two sisters so bonded. And after everybody else had gone home, I always make a meal for this workshop, and they stayed on to help clean up after the workshop, and we were washing dishes in my kitchen. And the one of them, Laura, who's now in her mid-40s, said to me, you know, just a few years before, on the 30th anniversary of the arrest of the trailside killer, she had taken it upon herself to send a letter to the man, David Carpenter's his real name, now serving under the death penalty, but he's been on death row in San Quentin for over 30 years. She wrote him a letter asking if she could go to see him. This was a rational woman living a sort of, a so-called normal life, loves her husband, loves her children, functioning fine in the world, but still haunted by what had happened over 30 years ago, and seeking resolution and imagining that it might take the form of actually going to San Quentin to face this killer. He said yes, she went to see him, it resolved exactly nothing. She even said that he had never confessed. The trailside killer, David Carpenter, never has confessed. And she had this fantasy, which actually sounded like the fantasy of a 13-year-old girl, that she would extract a confession from him. And she knew it was kind of crazy, but there was no rational thinking going on here. She went to see him. She did not get the confession. And she got no resolution whatsoever. But that was the moment that the little bell, and I'm sure it's one you're familiar with, both of you, went off that made me know this is my kind of story. An adult character still haunted by events from years before. And I don't just mean haunted in the ghost way, but haunted in the way that many of us are by experiences that we haven't fully gotten past. And that's the territory of my work often, especially experiences of youth that carry into age. So I asked them their permission to let me, it wasn't just to tell their story. I'm not really a fictionalizer of crime. I'm not a crime fiction writer. But they gave me a greater gift, which was to allow me to invent freely as I chose, using their experience as the basis. And that's what I did. And I said a minute ago that I'm not a writer of crime fiction, that ultimately what interested me was not the serial killer. And not the victims, although those are two justifiable subjects, but they're not my subjects. My obsession always as a writer are the crimes that take place in seemingly benign places, families, between husbands and wives, parents and children, brothers and sisters, sisters and sisters. And I wanted to look not so much at the criminal and the crimes as the effect of those crimes on this particular family and this series of characters. I had to up the ante from the real story. So I decided that my 13-year-old girl would be one of those girls, like me at 13, who just hungers for drama and excitement. And if she doesn't, if none presents itself, she's going to manufacture it. And she feels all-powerful, magical in the way that 13-year-old girls do, certain 13-year-old girls. And so she is going to help her father. She adores her father. And she sees him going down. What's she going to do? She's going to help him catch the killer. And she does it by setting her own self out as bait for him. My favorite bad review of this book is one that appeared on Amazon.com by a reader, and the woman said, she said, you know, the plot of After Her is just unbelievable. That, you know, the idea of how this girl is going to catch the killer is so unbelievable. And of course, I felt like saying, yes, that is the point. I worked really hard to think up the kind of plot that a 13-year-old girl would think would work. And crazily, it ends up sort of working. I felt that I'd be cheating you as a reader if I didn't give you an actual confrontation between these girls and the killer, which did not occur in the real story. But her plot is crazy and magical thinking, and crazily sort of works. I mentioned when I started talking about this book that although I've written now 13 books, if one were, and I'm not suggesting that you do this, to read them all together, you would certainly know a lot about me and my obsessions, whether it's my fiction or my memoir. Certain themes carry through again and again, and I don't always know it when I'm writing, but after the fact I recognize, oh, there comes that again. So I'll name a few that are really at the core of what this story is about. And one is family secrets. I can't look at any of these themes without looking at my own life. And I grew up in a family with a big secret, a big unmentionable fact that was never discussed. In my case, it was the fact that every night, in my family of dazzlingly articulate people whose dinner table conversation had to do with music and art and religion and literature and politics and even sex, there was one topic never discussed, and that was the thing that affected our lives more than anything else, the fact that every night my father got drunk, and every morning we pretended it never happened. And there is a big secret in every story that I've told, and it happens that the idea of uncovering the secret is an obsession of mine. Sadly, divorce is an obsession, and these are divorced parents. These are two parents who actually did love each other but could not be together, and so the primary family unit is the sisters. And I have to say that not having had the kind of sister relationship that I would have loved to have had, I loved, you know, they always say, write about what you know. Sometimes what I do is I write about what I wish I knew. I wished I had known that kind of relationship, and it propelled me to my laptop every morning at 5 a.m. to know that I was going to get to spend a day with two sisters having glorious adventures with each other. I've written a lot about mothers and daughters, but I was really interested in fathers and daughters, and this is very much a father and daughter story. But finally, at its core, it's about sisters. It's about the sisters, two girls who have these spectacular adventures with each other. Sometimes get into heaps of trouble, but once again, and have a very absent mother. And I should say here that too was writing about what I didn't know. I had an extraordinary, brilliant, inspiring mother who totally took over my life, and to whom I owed everything, I felt, growing up. I barely knew. She taught me everything I knew about writing. And I often felt when I wrote that I wasn't sure if it was her voice or mine, and in fact it was often hers. For the first many years it was hers. So the idea of two girls virtually without parents, the father's off trying to solve crimes, the mother is, we would now know, suffering from depression, although that term wasn't used in the 70s in the same way that it is now, allowed them not simply to get into trouble and to not do very well in school, but to discover who they were for themselves. And that was a thrilling idea to me. Fatherless sisters, sort of motherless sisters, raising each other out on a mountain. And getting into big trouble, but relying on each other and themselves. So I too am going to read, I'm going to read a little bit longer because I'm a ham. And I think I'll just read from the very beginning of this book also. The voice is that of the older of the two sisters. She's now an adult. She's in her 40s, and she's looking back over the summer of 1979, 1980. I should say here, this is another thing I didn't realize until after this book was all over. I go back and back now to periods, not ancient history, but recent history, and I figured out after this one was finished why I am drawn there. These are pre-technology times. As much as I depend on my iPhone and my laptop and my iPad and text and do all those things, they strike me as singularly soulless experiences to insert in a novel. And so I loved it that I got to, once again, as I did in my novel Labor Day and The Good Daughters, The Cloud Chamber, Where Love Goes. This is an older book. There's a couple who conducts their relationship by fax, so you know that's ancient history and probably not going to be a big seller. Soon it'll be in the historical fiction department. Okay, so we have the older of the two sisters. Her real name is Rachel, but her father calls her Farah. She and her sister like to play Charlie's Angels. And she's looking back on that summer. They live in the foothills of Mount Tamalpais. Nothing much ever happened on the mountain where we lived growing up, and we didn't get cable. We were always looking for a little excitement, so my sister and I made up situations. All we had was time. One day, we decided to see what it felt like to be dead. If a person's dead, they don't feel anything, Patty said. This is Patty for you. I had a red sweatshirt, the kind with a zipper up the front and a hood and pockets to keep gum. I spread it on a patch of grass on the hillside behind our house, with the sleeves stretched out as if they were a person who'd been run over by a truck, the hood off in a different position, so as much of the red part showed as possible, like a pool of blood. Lie there, I told my sister, pointing to a spot in the middle over the zipper part. She might disagree, but Patty nearly always did what I told her. If she had questions, she kept them to herself. I lay down next to her, close enough so plenty of the red part showed on either side of our bodies. Now what? Don't move. Don't let your chest go up and down when you breathe. Some people would have asked for an explanation, but not Patty. Letting her find out in her own time was part of my idea, and she understood this. For a long time, nothing happened. It was hot that day, but we just lay there. My nose itches, she said. Never mind, I told her. Just think about something else, something interesting. For me at the time, that would mean Peter Frampton, or the jeans I'd seen at the mall a couple of weeks earlier that were perfect in every way except the price, and the notebooks I wrote in where I made up stories I'd read to my sister that she said were better than Nancy Drew. For Patty, it would be Larry Bird executing a hook shot, or some dog she liked, which would be any dog that ever lived. Did you notice that cloud, she said? It's shaped like a dachshund. Who knew how much time passed? 10 minutes? An hour, possibly. Then I spotted it, a vulture, circling above our heads. First one, then two more. They were high up still, but it was plain from where they'd positioned themselves that we were the target. The place they were circling was directly over the spot where we lay. What now? Patty asked me. Shush, be still. Two more birds joined the others. The circle was getting tighter, as if they were zeroing in. They were coming lower, too, closer to our bodies. What if they try to peck our eyes out? No answer from me. Getting the vultures to spot us was the whole point. My sister should know this, and basically did. The vultures were swooping lower now, dive-bombing, making this terrible shrieking sound. They were closing in around us, shrieking not so much at Patty and me from the sound of it, as at one another. They were fighting over who would get to eat our eyeballs, probably. Then came one final shriek, not from one of the nearest birds, but one we hadn't noticed until now, a little farther off, but zeroing in. He sailed down toward us, body like an arrow, beak and talons aimed at our faces. I didn't have to tell my sister what to do. We jumped up screaming, running down the mountain toward our house. No time to claim my sweatshirt even, though later, when the birds were gone, we'd return for it, out of breath and holding each other, screaming. A person could scream as loud as she wanted on that mountain, and it felt good. We were always looking for excuses to scream.